Hello guys, this is Rafi here with my 1968 Pontiac Firebird, and today I want to do a recap of the installation that I did for Holley's Sniper EFI Quadrajet on my Pontiac 350. So first things first, let me start out with what it is I purchased, just so you guys know what the scope of the work and the overall expense is going to be. I got my kit from guys in Florida at EFISystemPro.com. Got this back in February of 2023, so these are prices at that point in time. So I got the black Sniper EFI Quadrajet system. I also got Holley's OE style fuel tank module. This basically is an EFI fuel pump that goes in the stock fuel tank, and not only does it make the operation quieter, you don't hear the fuel pump priming and making a whole lot of noise because it's in the tank, but at the same time, it eliminates the need for a return line. Installation kit, which was a combination of fittings and Earl's Vapor Guard hose, fuel pressure gauge adapter, and free t-shirt from them. All in all, this cost me just shy of $2,000. One more thing that's not on this invoice, I also got a mechanical fuel pump delete cap from my local auto parts store, so that I could remove the mechanical fuel pump, cap it off, and not worry about any stray fuel fittings and hoses coming off of it. So let me start from the back, because that's where everything began from. I'll tell you that all in all, the install took me about 1 week to do. I took my sweet time. I thought very carefully with how I wanted to route my hoses and all my electrical lines so that the installation can go as smoothly as possible. I retained the stock fuel tank, and first thing I did was drop it, take out the factory fuel sender out, and install the fuel pump module supplied by Holley. It physically looks identical to the factory fuel sender, so it goes in there with ease. It attaches to your factory fuel hoses, and all you have to do is run one electrical cable for the fuel pump relay from the back to the front. When the fuel tank was reinstalled, there is two small hoses on the right side on these Firebirds and Camaros, one for sending the fuel and one for return. I canceled the return nipple, and I replaced the carburetor fuel hose with Earl's Vapor Guard fuel hose that could handle the high PSI pressure from the fuel pump. There was a hard fuel line running on the right side under the rail here, under the car. Hard fuel line that runs on the right side up to the engine compartment, and all I did was wire tie the fuel relay electrical cable from the back to the front. So now moving forward, the factory fuel line is what I want to show next. Okay, so we're going to zoom in at this point. And let me try to brighten this up a little bit. So my factory hard fuel line ends right over here, and it's from here that I attached Earl's Vapor Guard fuel hose to continue running it to a fuel filter. Now, these Firebirds don't have a smart spot for the fuel filter, because when it's carbureted, the fuel filter is sitting somewhere up here. That's not going to cut it for fuel injection, because you have a high risk of fire should anything happen. So I ran the hose underneath the radiator support. It's tough to see it from here, but I basically ran it underneath the radiator support, and there's a reinforcement bar under the radiator support that is notched, and I tucked the fuel filter in there. The fuel filter was recommended by the guys at EFI System Pro. They sold me the correct one. And then here you could see how the fuel hose exits, comes up in between here and continues its way up to the inlet hose, or inlet I should say, for the Sniper EFI. In hindsight, this is probably not the smartest way of doing this. I think that I'll inevitably cut the hard fuel hose back nearby the firewall, and I'll run a fuel hose from there and up to the firewall, where I will install the fuel filter on the firewall, and then from there I'll run the exiting fuel hose back to the Sniper EFI. This way I don't have an extremely long hose that's going underneath, coming back around like that, and just basically going to cause the fuel to heat up in that hose. The shorter the route, the better it is. So that's how that installation happened. They do give you a number of inlets and outlets to choose from. Again, since I was using the fuel pump that's mounted in the fuel tank, I did not need a return line. So all I needed to do is worry about my inlet. So instead of going here, I went over here, installed my fuel pressure gauge in line, and the fuel enters from the front from here. I don't have to worry about an exit. So next I'll talk about the electrical connections that were required to finish off the install. So the electrical work is probably the one that's going to require the most thought, because you have to route it in such a way that it looks clean, and at the same time the electrical lines don't have any risk for damage. This is for the coolant pressure or coolant temperature sensor. This is supplied by Holley, so that's pretty easy to do. I had a spot over here on my Edelbrock Performer intake. This coolant temperature sensor I'm using to track my coolant temperature on my pressure on my instrument panel. This cable goes to the, so this cable goes to the, this cable is for power. You need a 12 volt, basically you need a steady 12 volt source when you put your key in the ignition position. When you put it on the on position, you need a steady 12 volt source, and when you crank it, you need to make sure that that 12 volt source does not go to zero. It doesn't lose power. If you do that, then you're gonna have a hard time starting the car. So they basically give you this power cable with positive, negative, and again that lead that you need for steady 12 volt electricity when you have the key in the on position. Now your wiring may be different, but on GM vehicles you basically need a pink wire so that you can have that steady 12 volt on when you have your key in the accessory or on position. I actually have a painless wiring system installed on my car, and it says right over here, to supply power to a fuel injection system, use engine section A wire number 920, which by the way is a pink color, so that I can have my fused ignition power source. So that's where my power wire went, so that I can have the voltage needed to crank the car and get the fuel primed into the throttle body. Okay, so starting from the bottom wire goes to my distributor. It's a Pertronix HEI distributor. The middle one makes its way, oops, down over here, the fuel to the harness. I don't recall what I use that for, sorry guys. And then the one in the middle that goes down basically is getting the electrical connection is supplying the electrical connection to the fuel pump relay to the backside. And then this is basically going to through the firewall into the instrument panel area for your LCD monitor. So I can't go detail by detail as to what I connected here, but all I could say is that I took my sweet time to route the wires, think about where each wire was going to go, where I was going to tuck my wire bundles in so that the engine compartment could look as neat as possible, and at the same time the wires don't get any damage from excessive heat. The hardest part was doing the fuel because I had issues with where I was going to install my fuel filter. So just think that through in your application as to where your fuel filter is going to go, because that is going to affect how you're going to route your fuel hoses the rest of the way, both after the fuel filter and before the fuel filter. So next I'm going to move to the inside of the car. So my inside's pretty neat. I've done a lot of work to make it look as factory as possible. This is my stock climate control for my vintage air conditioning system. Pontiac radio. And then what I did for the monitor, so before I had the EFI system, I had this bracket installed. This was a gauge bracket for my vacuum pressure and my AFR readings. So I kept the bracket in place, and all I did is attach the monitor to the bracket. I'll admit it's not as clean as it could be, but I can always go back and put some flat sheet metal in the back, spray paint it flat black, and make this look a little bit more uniform. But it's kind of cool because it allows me to monitor the readings of how the EFI system is running. I could track the AFR, I could track coolant temperature, and I can also track how much of idle air adjustment is being made by the throttle body. So the car's been sitting in the garage for a month right now, and this is the first time I'm going to be cranking it ever since. So let's see how it fires up. The fuel pump just basically primed the throttle body. So let's see what happens. Moment of truth. That pretty much explains it. sitting a month in the garage. Did not have to press the gas pedal, did not have to prime the carb. Just turned the key, a couple of revolutions over, and it just cranked up just like that. I also want to take the time to go over the obstacles that I had to overcome with doing this installation. So as I mentioned before, the fuel filter was a challenge. On these cars, the engine compartment is kind of crammed. You don't have a whole lot of open space to freely position your fuel filter. So that was one problem. And as I mentioned earlier in the video, I plan on relocating the fuel filter where the firewall is on that side, so I can have a shorter route for the fuel hose. The other issue was this side here. And when I switched over to the EFI, Sniper EFI, what I quickly found out was that the universal throttle cable that I used to have here from Locar wasn't going to cut it. The universal throttle cable wasn't going to give me the proper geometry so that I can get the throw that I needed from my gas pedal to get wide open throttle. You probably don't need to do this, but I figured it would look trick if I did it. This is an aluminum billet throttle cable bracket from Jegs, and I got this one, and I had to, as you can see over here, I had to carve some notches with a Dremel tool just so the throttle assembly can clear the bracket, just so I can get full throw, full wide open throttle. These bolts are extremely difficult to tighten down because you just don't have enough opening over here to put a ratchet driver from the top and just tighten those nuts. So I had to use small wrenches to get from the top as well as from the bottom of this rail, this fuel rail, just so I could tighten the bolts down. So these are going to be a little bit challenging. You got to use some patience, take your time, but eventually you'll get it tightened down. In my case, I had to replace the Locar universal throttle cable with a factory cable. I got this from Classic Industries. This is a factory Quadrajet cable for 68 Firebirds, and I used this to attach to this section here, and the throttle cable made its way to the firewall to the gas pedal. This in itself was another challenge. So you'll notice that I have the tie down bracket, and you'll notice that I have fender washers here. I have 5 fender washers here so that I can have the wide open throttle with the factory gas pedal. Without the fender washers, this cable is going to make its way into the firewall, and the attachment point sticks in too much into the firewall, so your gas pedal's leaning up against it, and your gas pedal doesn't have the proper geometry or the throw to give you wide open throttle. So what do you have to do? You have to make sure that the attachment point of the cable that's going into the firewall is not sticking in so much. You got to push it back out. So I needed to use a total of 5 fender washers to push the connection point outwards. Push the connection point outwards so that I can have the wide open throttle that I needed from the pedal. A lot of trial and error. This took a lot of time for me to get right. It basically took me almost about half a week to, by trial and error, install and reinstall the throttle cable just so I can get wide open throttle. The LCD monitor tells you if you're getting wide open throttle or not. It actually has a reading which shows what the percentage of your throttle pedal opening is. So by using the monitor as an aid, I was able to figure out whether or not I was getting wide open throttle. Outside of that, it's been reliable ever since. It's just really those little unforeseen circumstances are going to throw your timing off. So if you had the expectation that you could do this in 2 to 3 days, that's a bad expectation to have. Take your sweet time. It'll probably take you a week to do it. If you have a helping hand, you could do it in under a week with no problem whatsoever. I ended up installing this in the beginning of summer, drove it sporadically throughout, and I'll say that every dollar amount was worth it. I've had a Quadrajet on this engine. I've had Street Demon 625 on this engine as well. I've tried to tune those carbs to the best of my abilities using vacuum gauges and AFR monitors. You know, I've messed around with jets, I've messed around with metering rods, power pistons, you name it. And I just, as good as those carburetors were, it just is not the same as having something like this installed. The benefits of having this Quadrajet EFI are that you have that easy, no-nonsense startup, cold startup, hot startup. It's the same thing, no problems whatsoever. Your garage doesn't smell like fuel for a week as you're waiting for the fuel to evaporate from the carburetor bowls. You don't have that issue at all with this. Streetability, the throttle response is much more crisp than what the carburetor can do. No hesitation whatsoever. It smells good too. You know, it doesn't smell too rich, doesn't smell too lean. It's just right. And I'd definitely vouch for this product if you're thinking about doing the switch.